Good evening, everyone. I want to show you that this is one of the mementos from the World People Conference on Climate Change that I carry with me every day. And it's a ribbon that says "Protect Mother Earth," and on the other side, Pachamama, which is translation in Spanish. And this is the ribbon that I took with me on the same case into New Orleans from Bolivia, landing in my city that was, was now in its 5th disaster in a 5-year period. The 5th disaster being the BP oil spill. I'm going to stand if that's okay. I prepared a PowerPoint to go over, but it's mostly images and not lists of lots of text. But it's really to just kind of carry home the experience and the fight that we are waging in the Gulf region, in New Orleans, Louisiana, and places like Haden, Alabama. Oh, you've been there? Biloxi, Mississippi, Galveston, Texas, and many cities and communities in between. The social pressure that Ambassador Sol talked about is building in the Gulf region, and we would love to see solidarity with folks in the Bronx, Mothers on the Move, Sustainable South Bronx, and the beautiful work that you guys are doing and the fight that you guys are doing for your survival. For us, climate justice is really about eradicating the decisions that take our lives from us and take the places that we love from us and take the people that we love from us. So when we founded Advocates for Environmental Human Rights back in early 2000, it was really with the goal of pressing our government on fulfilling its human rights obligations to achieve environmental justice, because as we all know, there's no court you can go into the United States when environmental racism takes place in your community. And so the same thing, like with a climate agreement, being able to have enforcement mechanisms is extremely key. This idea of this tribunal is critical in terms of being able to have enforceability and accountability and protection. So, next slide, please. So part of our work is informed by this statement that Desmond Tutu said in an interview on the Today Show some years ago. And it's, "I'm not interested in picking up crumbs of compassion thrown from the table of someone who considers himself my master. I want the full menu of human rights." And that full menu really comes into play when you look at issues of environmental degradation, environmental racism, and injustice, because your right to life, your right to health, your right to freedom from racial discrimination, your right to security of your home, your right to privacy, your right to be able to be parents, becomes violated. Sorry. So this is extremely important for me. And I'm not a person who can talk through tears, so just give me a minute. Okay, so next slide, please. And it's also informed by the great work of environmental justice leaders who convened the first People of Color Leadership Summit on Environmental Justice back in 1991. And just an incredible gathering of people from all walks of life dealing with environmental justice across this country, coming together in Washington, D.C., and putting together a call to action and principles of environmental and economic justice. And there's 17 principles, but Principle 10 speaks to environmental justice, environmental injustice as a violation of fundamental human rights. And so we take our charge from this, as well as the community leaders in Louisiana, like Marjorie Richard, who said that no one has to tell her when her human rights are violated, because she feels it every time her daughter has an asthma attack. So, sorry I'm so emotional about this, but this is emotional. It's not an academic exercise. It's not legal wrangling. It's about your ability to live, and to live freely, and with safety, and with health, and with knowing what your future can be like, and having some control over that, and not having it be ripped away from you. Next slide. So, with that, we take on environmental justice. It can't be done on a case-by-case basis. That was what we did prior to founding Advocates for Environmental Human Rights. There was a community group dealing with a toxic pollutant facility or some hazardous operation or serious toxic exposure issues. And we'd go in there and do advocacy support and litigation and legal services. And thank God all of those battles David and Goliath battles ended successfully on the community's terms. But the next day the phone would ring and it's another community calling with the same problem. And so Natalie Walker and I, who's the co-director of Advocates for Environmental Human Rights with me, talked about what is it that we're not doing right that's not lifting all boats with these huge, very resource-intensive battles. It doesn't help other communities. So like a win in South Bronx is not a win in Brooklyn. A win in Brooklyn is not a win in New Orleans. A win in Bayview Hunters Point out of San Francisco is not a win in Appalachia. What is it that's wrong with this? And it was really, it's a systemic problem. And so we really undertook the work of relearning and re-educating ourselves away from the miseducation we got in law school that there are environmental laws that are set out to protect you. Because what we had been doing was trying to find winning arguments in environmental law, and we were successful, but it wasn't easy. And so part of the trick that we've all been duped with is thinking that, oh, there's something in the Clean Air Act for me. There's something in the Clean Water Act for me. Or I've got a civil rights law protection against. No, you don't. You do not. And so, can you do the slide, please? So whether it's dealing with pesticide drift, next, or next slide. Dealing with new toxic facility permits and rallies and demonstrations, or defending neighborhoods from hazardous operations. Oh, sorry, I went too fast. We can't do this one at a time. And so the whole system really needs to be completely transformed because it's really ran on a it's ran on an anti-environmental protection approach and perspective. So let's look at that. When we look at how protective environmental laws are in the United States, because our government goes around to other countries telling them what environmental protection should be and what their laws should look like, it's important to study these two pictures. Does anyone have any guesses as to the picture on your left, where it was taken?
Lake Charles.
Lake Charles, okay. Slide. Oh, it's in Norco, Louisiana. Close. Norco is an acronym for New Orleans Oil Refining Company, which was bought in the 1930s by Shell. And that's the Shell chemical facility that you see in the background behind a community playground that is all African-American neighborhood of Diamond, which was a former slave plantation. Behind the photographer is the Shell oil refinery. And so this picture was taken some 30 years after the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and a bevy of other laws were enacted with thousands of regulations by agencies to implement those legislative mandates and those environmental laws. But as for the picture on the next side, any guesses? Come on, y'all. Huh? Yeah, the picture, yeah. Is it Norco, Louisiana? Okay. Of Norco, the same community. Okay, so slide please. It's from Durban, South Africa. Both pictures were taken the same year. We happened to be there for a world conference. Either was on against racism or on sustainable development. They were both kind of back to back. And so there was an environmental justice tour that community activists organized for U.S. environmental justice groups and people who were participating in the World Conference. But this picture was taken before there were any national laws in South Africa. So, who's zooming who here on how protective our environmental system is if we've got communities and people and children living in communities that look exactly like communities with no environmental laws. Okay? So let's stop trying to pretend that I just need to, if that lawyer can't find this remedy under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act or the Clean Air Act, it's a bad lawyer. The law is not set up to protect our communities. Okay? Sometimes we've been lucky, but it's because you're lucky. It's not because it says you have a right to a healthy environment. You have a right to a future living in the place that you call home. Next slide. So this is the consequence, and this was of these kinds of decisions, what it means to really live as a practical matter without environmental protection. This is what remains of the Morrisonville community, a community that was founded before the Civil War by some really savvy black folks were able to extricate and emancipate themselves from slavery and settle this area, which is now infamously known as in Cancer Alley, which is between Baton Rouge, the state capital, and the Gulf of Mexico along the Mississippi River, where there's some 200 petrochemical facilities operating in predominantly African-American neighborhoods, so hence the name Cancer Alley, and there are cancer clusters and all that. But so for Morrisonville, with the homes, the churches, the small businesses, the schools, the daycare centers, all of that was raised. People were relocated and moved in different places by the company in the background, which is Dow Chemical. So all that remains of Morrisonville is their home cemetery. In order for residents of Morrisonville to enter the cemetery, they have to go through the security kiosks set up at Dow to get clearance to go and visit their departed loved ones. Okay? So Morrisonville is one of 5 historic African-American communities that no longer exist because of toxic pollution. That situation is compounded by indigenous communities on the coastal areas of Louisiana that are now dealing with the consequences of the BP oil disaster. And in those communities, we have tremendous amount of coastal erosion brought about by companies drilling in the Gulf, digging channels through wetlands, and which is causing the erosion. So if you think about it, if you've ever been to a beach and you've dug sand near the beach shoreline, as the new tide water rushes in, what you dug gets bigger, right? And so that's what's happening in the coastal area. So you've got tremendous land loss happening there and the disappearance of communities, so much so that the United Homan Nation, one of the indigenous tribes in the coastal part of Louisiana, is buying property in the northern part of Louisiana as their future home site, because this is not sustainable for them. I should also mention that many of the indigenous tribes in coastal Louisiana are not federally recognized because of the lobbying by oil and gas companies against federal recognition. Okay. Which means that they don't have that autonomous control over their communities. Next slide. So before Katrina, we had snow, which was unheard of. The last snowfall we had in New Orleans was in the 1930s. That's my mom. It was a lot of fun. We were saying this is climate change, but this is kind of fun, having snow. And that's about as much snow as we can pack for a snowman. And he lasted about a week on the porch post there. Then 8 months later was Hurricane Katrina. Next slide. And so this is what, we've all seen this. And for many folks, this help sign hasn't really gone away. It's still there because of, not because floodwaters are still there, floodwaters are gone, but because of the way in which our government has decided to make it impossible for people to return in order to benefit friends and cronies and developers who see the land as something that they can profit on. So we have a tremendous housing crisis brought about by the demolition of public housing and affordable housing, the waiver of federal funds, waiver of regulations for federal funds dedicated to people of low and moderate income, so that means they don't get the benefit, discrimination and home repair grants against African Americans. That's just housing. There's a similar story for education, criminal justice, environmental protection, employment opportunities, the treatment of migrant workers. It's a real calamitous, oppressive situation that we've got in the Gulf region. And so notwithstanding what you may have saw on the 5th anniversary where our media was trying to let mostly white people in this country know that everything's fine now, it's worse now than it was before. Okay, next slide. And one of the ways in which that's able to happen is through a federal law that is triggered when a national disaster is declared by the president. It's called the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. And this law does 2 things. It gives the president broad discretionary authority to do absolutely nothing, which is what we saw after Hurricane Katrina, and it's legal. It's the same law that was used to kick out lawsuits brought by people who were exposed to toxic air after 9/11 because they were told by the Bush administration and the EPA that the air was fine and it wasn't. Because the president has that much broad discretionary authority to make a disaster even worse under this law. It also denies any individual affected by a national disaster the right to claim assistance for anything, including, according to the language of the statute, the reduction of life-threatening risks, emergency medical care, food, and shelter. So when we're talking about climate change, know that we've got a federal law right now in the books that says you are owed nothing. You deserve nothing. And the best thing you can hope for is that you have a president who will make the right decisions. And so what this thing sets up is a dynamic where with that broad discretionary authority of the president, it also rolls down to the governor and local elected officials. And so there's this game and this bartering game between all of those levels of government over where the money will go. And if you're in a community where your interests are not being served by your elected officials, they won't be in the event of a disaster either. And that's what we've got in the Gulf region. Next slide. So this is what was the help that finally came to people at the convention center in New Orleans. And so what Father Miguel was talking about, that militarized force, this, not food, not water, not medical doctors, not humanitarian people or anything like that. It was armed military. And you see them coming down, cascading down the elevators, looking for people to shoot. And I've got tons more photos like this, just seeing the, I mean, it was like, and so when you look at what was going on, it makes you wonder, like, was this some sort of experiment to see how, you know, what they could do? Because there were these rumors of people shooting at helicopters, which didn't happen. Rumors of people shooting police officers, which didn't happen. In fact, our police shot innocent people and are now facing indictment and life sentences in prison. But the treatment was like we were enemies on the battlefield, not people who were in desperate need of rescue. Next slide. So this is my home again after Katrina. It's now February 13th, 2007. And on February 12th, February 13th at 3 o'clock in the morning, we had a major tornado that passed through. And it felt like, it lasted for so long that I began to kind of imagine this thing as in with a personality. And it felt like someone just trying to shake my house out of the ground. It was just a violent shaking back and forth until it just passed over. And it actually killed a woman in another neighborhood in New Orleans who was in a FEMA trailer, an elderly woman. My cousin Helene and her son were caring for her. They lived across the street from her. But this thing came at 3 o'clock in the morning. One of the things that was kind of, and so this is the oak tree in the park that fell over, was uprooted. There's a utility pole careened towards the house, tons of roof damage and all that sort of stuff. But as the sun began to rise, one of the things that was comforting for all the neighbors after we checked in on each other, we got flashlights and utility wires on the line and all that stuff, was we're okay. We know what our day is going to be like. And that for us was refreshing, because after Katrina, you did not have that comfort or confidence what your day was going to be like or what the next day was going to be. And so notwithstanding all that damage in the neighborhood, the fact that we were still there, the fact that we knew what was going to happen next, was psychologically comforting in a way that was gratifying after the disaster we went through with Katrina. And it's something to go through when you don't know where you go next. And it's hard to plan your next day, and you can't go back to your home, your family photos, all the things that you hold as precious possessions. You don't know what condition they are, and you don't know when you'll be able to see them again. Relatives, neighbors, friends, you don't see them because you're in some other location now. And it got to the point where I was missing people that I can't stand, right? Because at least I know them, you know, and not knowing where they are and all that. So, you know, this is going through a disaster. The psychological trauma that it brings is beyond, you know, the brick and mortar that falls down, which is also important. But this stuff lasts, and the effect on children is even greater. Next slide. So then we had snow. And this was even greater than the snow we had with my mom cheesing in the background, because this snow was not even predicted by the weather folks, right? And it was much more than we had in the Christmas, December before Hurricane Katrina. Next slide. And okay, can we go back? So that dark spot right here, that's where the oak tree used to be. And one of the things that was great about that oak tree, see, I live in this side, my mom lives on that side, my sister lives on that side. New Orleans, we like to keep our families close and kind of compound-like. But I can go between the houses with nothing on, because that oak tree was like, it covered everything. It had complete privacy, so now I gotta, like, you know, dress up to go next door and all that stuff. Yeah, so one of the things that we have done at Advocates for Environmental Human Rights was we filed a human rights petition against our government for creating an environmental regulatory system that violates fundamental human rights. And we did this on behalf of residents in Mossville, Louisiana, a community, not Morrisonville, Mossville, a community in southwest Louisiana that is surrounded by 14 toxic facilities, all African American, all rural, with really strong historic cultural roots. And in March of this year, we won a small battle in this struggle in Mossville and for environmental justice communities across the country. And that was the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is the judicial arm of the Organization of American States, which our government is a member of, admitting this petition for a review on the merits. And by doing that, it's a recognition that there's no place in the United States that people can go for remedies against environmental racism and injustice. And so this petition, you can get it on our website and see the reply brief that the U.S. government submitted, as well as the ruling by the Inter-American Commission, and it'll be updated as this thing moves forward. But this was like really great news because we discussed how the rights to life, health, freedom from racial discrimination, and privacy as relates to the security of the home are all violated. And the Commission found that when it comes to racism and privacy, there's no question that the U.S. government has no remedy, because the right to freedom from racial discrimination in the United States is limited to only intentional acts. So if you can prove that it was intentional, good luck. But if it's something that is so systematized through a bureaucratic process that's race neutral, you're out of luck. And much of our racism comes through the latter, not the former. In the human rights perspective, it doesn't matter if it's intentional or it's a results-based discrimination, it's discrimination. When it comes to privacy, of course, our Supreme Court has made it really clear that our privacy rights are limited to this zone of our body. What we do with it, decisions we make with it, who we let around it, that's privacy. But in terms of the security of your home as a privacy right, But under a human rights perspective and legal framework, that is a privacy right as well. We are, at this point, asked the Commission to reconsider the rights to life and health, because the Commission, in its admissibility ruling, thought that through the discretionary authority of agencies like EPA, that there was some way in which you can get justice around health and life, and the petition that we filed was that no, that ain't the case either. So we're hoping that they will reconsider that point. But we at least got two, racism and privacy, being violations. So on the same day that this appeared in our local New Orleans Times-Picayune, right next to it was Obama opening. Yeah, and it's sort of those things that, I just kind of glanced at it because I was just all enthralled with this article. And I thought, that's a shame. But it did, and when we, in the particular copy of the newspaper that we had in the office, it was folded along that seam in the middle. And it was sometime about a week after the BP oil spill, or oil disaster, I should say, because it was really not a spill, that I remembered, wasn't there something on the other side of this Mossville human rights thing? And it was this. About 2 weeks before the BP oil disaster occurred. Next slide. So about the BP oil disaster. Jeff, I need to correct myself, you're absolutely right. The oil reservoir is some 18,000 feet below the surface. The sediment of the Gulf of Mexico is 5,000 feet below the surface, so some 13,000 feet below that is where they were able to tap this oil reservoir. And 11 people died, employees had made numerous reports of malfunctions of the blood preventer and other malfunctions on the rig that were ignored by BP and its contractors, and we had this real tragic result. And now, instead of recognizing the fact that BP kills its workers, whether it's on the oil rig or at its facility, its refinery in Texas, our government has put BP in charge of cleanup and containment workers. And the decision by BP was that, well, they won't receive respiratory or protective gear. One of the things that's really interesting with that, as well as the use of dispersants on the oil, is that in both instances, our members of the Obama administration, leaders of OSHA and the EPA, requested BP to do two things. One, reduce the use of dispersants. Second, provide some protective gear for cleanup and containment workers. BP's response was, show us what's in the law or regulation. And then the agencies acquiesced. The thing that is infuriating to all of us is that under the law that deals with oil incidents and oil disasters like this one, a request by a governmental official is good enough. It's in the law. it's called the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. And so why our government would not insist that those actions be taken, it kind of makes us think about like the Katrina dynamic of 5 days without any assistance, and here's your military force coming at you. Like, what's really going on here? Because it's not, it doesn't seem like it matters if it's the Bush administration or the Obama administration at this point in terms of having decisions made that are against our best interests and make us very vulnerable to serious health threats and other problems. I guess I should also say is that, you know, we've all seen the news about, hey, the oil is gone. And now they're backtracking on that and saying that they need more scientists to help them. Because other scientists, independent scientists from universities in the Gulf region found the oil. And there have been since major massive fish kills, which our state of Louisiana Fish and Wildlife Services says is coming from low oxygen. And so, you know, that is something that local officials and definitely the public at large is like, you know, saying bullshit on. And so this is the kind of thing that we're going on where our government is, you know, we can't see the difference between government and BP at this point. And that's been the case from day one with the oil disaster, but it's also been there from very beginning. If you think about the situation in Morrisonville, right? That was a disaster too. What happened wasn't mourned in any way like, or given national exposure attention, but it was every bit of a disaster as this one, where you can let a company destroy an entire community and dislocate folks where so cultural connections, social relations, family relations are broken. And that's okay. And it can happen 5 times, 6 times, 10 times, 20 times. And so we see the same kind of fate waiting for us in the Gulf region as truth and facts and information are suppressed, and sometimes violently, as people try to take photos of what they see, and their BP guards are there, you know, to charge them with, you know, threaten arrest and that sort of thing. So if we don't know what the level of damage is, how can we talk about what our recovery will be? And we see that same kind of snow job with climate change. If we really don't know what we're talking about in terms of the impact and the consequences of this stuff on our lives and in our communities, how can we really, and if that's hidden and taken from us, you know, there's your lack of urgency. You know, and so we spend more time in this country talking about whether or not it's a hoax and the email business than we do about saving people's lives in the places that we call home. Next. One of the things that we did in the, that we have done in this post-Katrina world we're living in the Gulf region is that it's really made us one family in the southern Gulf Coast region. So from Coden, Alabama to Galveston, Texas, there's this strong connection of advocacy groups and communities working together through the Katrina crisis and now with the BP oil disaster. One of the things a number of groups got together and did was they had a forum on climate change in April of 2009. And at that forum, we came up with these 10 steps, which we can, I've got copies of, which can be handed out on what we thought should be in a climate change treaty, recognizing the fact that we didn't want to get into CO2 levels and it's rising or it's spiking, but really make it real that when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about children being separated from parents. We're talking about people becoming homeless. We're talking about people dying and people suffering injuries. We're talking about communities not being able to exist again. And so for us, that's what climate change means. We're not looking at ways in which the law and science can be manipulated to prevent us from doing what we need to do to save the places that we call home. And so I should just quickly identify the folks in the photos. At the top is the youth group of the Zion Travelers Community Cooperative Center in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, which is one of the areas hard hit by the BP oil drilling disaster. Right behind them is the Mississippi River, and they're just a few miles from the Gulf of Mexico on the levee. They're standing on the levee. And they do a lot of work and education of themselves around valuing their ecosystem, valuing their environment. And so I'm there with like 6 and 10-year-olds talking about identifying brackish water and water currents and animals that they're seeing along the levees of the riverbank. The second photo is Mr. Felton, who's a member of the United Homa Nation that I talked about earlier. And this was at an Elders Festival that they give once a year. And then below that are community leaders and families in Biloxi, Mississippi, on their beach. And this is Coastal Women for Change and the Hope Community Development Agency are the members there. So these are just, you know, three of many, many groups in the Gulf region that are really hot and bothered about the kind of change we need to protect the places that we call home. Thank you.
So I can see the majority of you. So my name is Tanya Fields. As Mychal so graciously introduced me, I want to say thank you all for coming. I am extremely flattered to be able to speak here. I don't feel quite qualified to be here in front of or on this panel with these people who are experts. I'm not sure if I'm yet an expert on the academic level, but I am certainly an expert on the life level as a mother and as an activist. I also would like to take this time to say thank you to Ambassador Sol. I never got to thank him personally. I would not have been able to go to Bolivia if I had not been able to take my daughter with me. Our visas were covered by the Bolivian embassy, and when I went to get my visa, they said, oh, well, that'll be $181. And I said, for what? And they said, for your daughter. And I was like, I can't afford that. And the ambassador so graciously extended a free visa to my infant, who at the time was 6 months. None of my children, I have 4 of them, so this is a gang of us. None of them have passports, but Lola has a little 6-month-old picture in her passport. She's a rock star amongst the other children. So I wanted to say thank you for that. I also feel like I very much have the privilege of going last, because much of what was said is very much my current life. I always say that the Hunts Point area of the South Bronx, in particular, the South Bronx has many EJ issues. Robert Moses really did a number on the Bronx when he decided that every major throughway was going to cut through that borough. But the South Bronx, but the Hunts Point area in particular is much like environmental justice on meth. We have 18 open waste transfer stations. Many of those pictures that Monique showed in her slideshow look exactly like my neighborhood. We have something, I think it's a 20-acre park right behind NYAFCO, which for 15 years processed, it was called, first NYAFCO stands for New York Organic Fertilizer Company. But let's be clear, organic sounds nice, organic sounds good. Nothing that came out of this facility was my idea of what organic was. What it did was it processed something like 74% of the municipal waste, right? So the Bronx, so not only the Bronx, but Brooklyn and Manhattan and Staten Island, all of that waste got carried into NYAFCO. And guess by which method it got there? By diesel truck. So not only did I have literal shit, excuse my language, coming through my community, but then it came on a big old diesel truck, which gives my children asthma. Right? So on top of that, we've got that. Then we've got the second largest food distribution center in the world. We get 16,000 diesel truck trips every day. Not a week, a day. Right? When I go outside in the summertime, I feel like I can cut the air with a knife. I moved into this community at 21 years old. I had a 3-month-old baby. It was my first and only apartment. I was a city girl. I lived in Manhattan, but I wasn't rich. We lived in Harlem, which had its own issues. I was just too young to realize what they were. I was very unsettled when I moved into that community. There was an illegal war that was just starting. I was working in the corporate sector while putting myself through school full time. I literally had this thing in the pit of my stomach, this uneasiness. I wanted to do something, and I didn't know how to do this thing. I didn't know where the other people were. I lived in this community that I had already had these predispositions about. The only time I ever went to the Bronx was to go to Yankee Stadium or to the Bronx Zoo. So I knew nothing about my own community. And it stayed that way for a long time. And then I suffer from respiratory issues. My child, who just keeps finding her way up here, she was an asthmatic. She was in the hospital twice for pneumonia before the age of 1. And I knew there was something happening and I was not crazy. And so then I came in contact with this organization called Mothers on the Move. I actually happened to find them by accident, right? I see this large sign that says Madres en Movimiento. And I'm saying, okay, I'm a mother. I'm currently on the move. Maybe this is for me. This imposing black Puerto Rican woman walks up to me as I'm standing in the doorway, trying to figure out if I'm courageous enough to step through the threshold and ask what's happening. And she said, do you like what you see in the window? I said, yeah. And then she said, so come inside. And it wasn't really her asking me, it wasn't really a solicitation, it was a command. And I was not going to tell Wanda no. And when I walked through those doors, they had me at hello. For the rest of my time in the Bronx, I've been involved with them. I got so deeply involved with them that it actually spurred me to create my own organization 2 years ago called the Black Project. I graduated college, I graduated from Baruch, but it was really by not only the grace of God, but having a network behind me. As a single woman at that time, who had 2 children in college, was on the welfare system, slung coffee at Starbucks, had been displaced. It was very difficult for me to continue to move forward. I was consistently subjected to gender bias and racist policies and legislations in the housing system, through the welfare system, through the shelter system that made it extremely difficult for me to move forward. And I knew, again, this was not something that was coincidental. All of these things that we're talking about today are very deliberate. I tell members of the Black Project often that there is a lot of investment in your poverty. You are poor, and poor people are some of the best people to make money off of. The environmental justice industrial complex is very, very deliberate. There is no unintentional. It is all very intentional, right? Through various means of things. And I always tell people nothing happens in a vacuum, right? Environmental justice is a civil right, right? Because I can sit here, if we have much more time, and map out how environmental justice is a direct line to the prison pipeline. I can show you how environmental justice is affecting the education of our children. I'll give you one little stat. Those big trucks I talked about that produce all of that black smoke that you see, those diesel exhaust fumes, there was a Columbia study back in 1998 or so, that Sustainable South Bronx also had their hand in, that showed that ADD, ADHD, and reproductive diseases are tied to diesel exhaust fumes. So when your little black or Latino child cannot sit still in class, it's not because he's black and Latino. It's because he is black and Latino living in a poor community. 8 out of 10 poor communities have at least one polluting facility next to it. So can you imagine the environmental hazards that are happening when you've got 14 polluting facilities? That I only have 2 entryways to the waterfront in my community because Con Edison and NIAFCO and waste transfer stations take up all the rest. There are people in the Bronx that did not know that we had a Bronx River because there were more tires in that river than there was actually water. There are still people who do not know that we have a Bronx River. So, all of these things are extremely deliberate. Climate change for me has to happen on a very local level because many of the residents of my community, including myself sometimes, climate change is like here. This conversation is very difficult to have. It is really hard to get someone to feel bad for a polar bear, which is what people think of when they think of climate change. It is really hard to get poor people to think about melting ice caps. It is very difficult to get them to think about cap and trade or even understand what it means when you can't pay the Con Edison bill. It is difficult to get them to think about any of those things if you're consistently in housing court. It is very difficult to think about those things if your child has an IEP and they want to leave your child behind. Again, so that no child behind thing, they're leaving a lot of kids behind. All those things are very difficult to understand something that seems that has been presented in such an academic way, such as climate change. So what I have to say is when people say, climate change, I can't deal with that right now. I say, oh, you have to deal with it because most of the isms that you are currently being subjected to are coming under climate change. The majority of poor people of color in this country live along the coastline. If we start to see sea level rise, Hunts Point will disappear, right? We're going to be one of those communities that starts to disappear. When we start to see that there are issues with water drying up, with there being less land to actually farm on, we see that in the price of our fruits and vegetables going up, right? I live in a community and much of my work is around food justice, right? And food justice is directly tied to climate change. If I can't get water to my land, if I can't find land to actually farm on, then the fruits and vegetables that we've been importing actually become much more expensive. And in poor communities, who the majority of people are in EBT, are still spending most of their disposable income on food. And let me tell you about this food that they are getting. You are paying $3.99 for a pound of red peppers. You are paying $1.99 a pound for broccoli, right? That's wearing a blue fur coat, right? It's more expensive for less quality produce. And then how does that then trickle down into the public health issues that you're facing in poor communities? What you have are people who are on a limited budget, who have limited time because many of them are working untraditional service sector jobs, right, with untraditional work hours. They have limited time to actually be educated and or prepare healthy meals, and so they go for the quick fix. If it costs me $1.99 to get one bunch of broccoli, and I actually need 4 bunches to feed my family of 4, you're looking at $8 just for broccoli. So what happens? I become a McDonald's dollar millionaire. I can take $8 and I can get 2 boxed apple juices, 3 small fries, 2 cheeseburgers, a McChicken, and everybody just ate. So all of these things are relevant. If you have children who cannot sit still, who are being pushed in to special education classes, who are then not getting the individualized attention that you need, they are 10 times more likely to drop out before they graduate high school, and then 20 times more likely to be incarcerated. You cannot tell me that climate change and environmental justice does not affect the scope of our community.
Yeah, thank you.
This is the way that we need to start breaking it down to the people in our community. Because as this gentleman said, it is absolutely right. Until we start getting, and I think also Ambassador Simone said it as well, until we start getting not only just NGOs and schools and government, but the actual proletariats, the people who are living under these negative impacts, to rise up and be revolutionary and say we will no longer demand this, these changes are not going to happen. It is amazing to me when people say they cannot do this. They absolutely can. I didn't even know about the Stafford Act. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I found myself saying, you cannot live in a country that does this. I was a political science major in college. Surprise. One of the things that used to always come up is when people would say, the forefathers of this country, of the Constitution, were so amazing. I would be the lone voice that would say, why were they so amazing? You had a bunch of wealthy, land-owning white men writing a document that would continue to keep other land-owning, wealthy white men wealthy and owning land. Yep. And so, when you see that it takes 15 or 20 or 30 or 45 years to get some small change happening, which is usually just some half-assed concession of what we originally wanted, that was deliberate. The actual document in which this country was built on made it so. And so not only do we need to see just these small acts happening, but there needs to be a systemic change all the way down to constitutional acts that make it so. My right to vote is not actually a right. It is something that needs to be renewed every 30 years. That should let you know there's something inherently wrong with the document on which this country was built. Don't get me wrong. There are a lot of things that are actually great. My ability to be able to say this and not disappear tomorrow is wonderful. In certain countries, this type of rhetoric would have me disappear in the middle of the night. And certainly that has happened in this country as well. but not maybe with the same frequency and audaciousness that it is happening in other developing countries who are also fighting for this right. And so what we really need is to make sure that we are finding solidarity, not just in the proletariats of developing nations, but in the proletariats of this nation as well, and other individualized nations, developed nations, Western nations. There has to be not this concentration on all of the differences that we've got going on, because all of that is that's smoke and mirrors. These are things that are fanned by the mainstream media to keep us fighting with each other, so that we're not seeing the real things that are happening. Pro-life, pro-choice, Republican, Democrat. All of these things are all things that make us just distracted by some of the things that are real civil rights issues that are not being addressed. One of the issues that the Black Project is fighting for is for urban agriculture. And I had a chance to travel to New Orleans, which was a trip of mixed emotion for me. Katrina affected me very deeply, because although I was not as involved in this as I was when Katrina happened, I remember it was like a car crash that you shouldn't watch, but you got to slow down and see it unfold. I kept the TV on 24 hours a day, but I would find myself sobbing because I knew there was something wrong. There was this song that U2 and Green Day did called All Saints Day, and it was about 9/11. And in the live version, Bono happens to yell out, there's a woman on a roof holding a sign saying, I am an American. And that really bothered me, because you see these images of people standing on rooftops begging to be saved, and then you have something called the Stafford Act that says you as a human being don't have the right to be out of immediate risk. And Katrina was the manifestation of that. And yet here it is 5 years later, 7 years after the illegal war started, and you still have just big vats of land that are unavailable. People whose homes and land have been stolen from them. And don't be fooled by some of the propaganda that is happening. They will tell you, what kind of fool would live this many feet below sea level? Katrina was a disaster that did not have to happen. And for me, I could hold Katrina up as the example to other places that are on the verge of having their own Katrinas. It is a wake-up call. The Lower Ninth Ward, which was decimated, had the highest Black ownership, not just in New Orleans, but of all of Louisiana. It was not the hurricane that caused the issue in Katrina. It was the breaking of the levees, which have been said over and over and over again were not adequate. And those levees were never brought to be adequate because it was next to a working class Black community. You go to New Orleans, the Garden District looks great. Downtown New Orleans looks great. And then you literally go across the tracks into the Lower Ninth Ward. You have people who are still next to houses that have those X's and may say 6 here and then 0 on the bottom. That means 6 people died and there were no survivors. How do you heal when you have the constant reminder that your country has not allowed you to rebuild your community? And so I live in a community where we have a 49% vacancy rate. What that means is that 49% of the land in my community is vacant, that's residentially zoned. I live in a city that says I can buy a piece of property and sit on it for 20, 30, 40 years with no accountability to the outside community. And when it is right to gentrify that community, then I'll sell it, get $1.5 million, and then effectively push out the people who had to deal with the negative impact of that piece of neglected land. What our group is saying is that we respect people's right to own land. We do not respect your right to not do anything with that land and hold no accountability to the people in that community. And so we have started doing, much to the chagrin of the local police department and the landowners, is just popping the locks and going in there, cleaning it up and planting stuff. What we are now trying to get legitimized is that I have the second largest food distribution center in my community. Almost none of that food goes to my local supermarket. I can go into the produce terminal, which I do often, asking for donations for my community events. And I can pick out pomegranates, and I can pick out fresh asparagus, and I can get spring mixed lettuce. And when I go to the local C-Town on Southern Boulevard, I can get crappy iceberg lettuce. I can get wet, nasty romaine lettuce in a bag that's actually expired. I can get strawberries that are wearing that same beautiful fur coat. Right? We've got Nebraska land right in the distribution center. They don't sell Nebraska land. They sell us meat that when we get home and take it out the styrofoam packaging and turn it over, it's all nasty and black on the back. Right? You got food, it looked all pink at the top, and then you get it home and you flip it and you're like, whoa, what is this? You get, as Malcolm X said, you got bamboozled, let it stray. You didn't land on bad meat landed on you. So, this is what we are dealing with. And so what we are saying is that people in communities like this, local agriculture is the crux of us having a more just food system, a more just economic system. Because if I can find a community garden or an urban farm within a 5-block walking distance, I don't have to pay $2.99 for a red bell pepper. I don't need 16,000 diesel trucks coming through my community every day. That's not supplying food to my family. We can start talking about community development. There have been studies that show, there was one in particular that was shown, I can't remember who it was done by, but I do remember what the content of it was. That young women who had view of just one tree outside of their window did better on their homework than the young lady who did not. There are prisons that are effectively using horticultural therapy to rehabilitate, the prisons that are interested in rehabilitation, because many of them are not, because it's big business in prison. But the prisons that are interested in rehabilitation, or at least have one advocate that wants to do an experiment, they have shown that horticultural therapy has worked to effectively decrease recidivism in prisoners. And so when you tell me that community gardens, which are in this city actually in jeopardy, when you tell me that urban farms cannot be done in cities when actually during World War II we had victory gardens and about 70% of all of our food was grown locally, I say that that's BS. You're blowing smoke up my tuchus because there is a lot of lobbying going on to make sure that you can continue to make money off of my community. This is why climate change is important to us. This is the reason I am doing this as a mother. This is one of the reasons that I bring my gang of children with me, because these are conversations that we actually have in our home. And these are the conversations that we need to be having with our children. Because some of us might adjust a little bit. But when you get them at that age, and you can get them to understand, right, that they are the gatekeepers of what's coming up, and we're thinking about what kind of world we're going to be leaving behind for them, it is absolutely important to have that youth component involved in these conversations. Because climate change may not blow until I'm dead and gone, but my grandchildren are going to have to deal with those repercussions. That is certainly not the legacy that I want to leave. And I'm hoping that the people in this room who will strategize with us also agree this is not the legacy that they want to leave for their grandchildren. Thank you.